As we've heard, resistance to the Nazis came in many forms, whether it was giving food to those in need, hiding a child, or taking up arms to stop the onslaught of Nazi aggression. When we think of resistance, too often we only conjure up the images of men and women hiding in the forest and fighting back in the black of night. We think of hidden bombs or skulking in the streets in the dark. When I was growing up, this is what resistance was to me. It was this resistance on an individual and a national level. The United States entered the war against the Nazis on December 11, 1941, and immediately began preparations for fighting the Nazis in Europe. On my mother's side, the story of resistance comes at a very high personal cost. My great-grandfather, Philip Kurzer, immigrated to America from the newly founded Ukraine soon after the end of World War I. He arrived in New York with his father, Moshe, and his brother, whose name we have never known. I have the honor to carry the Hebrew name of those two men that took a chance to move to the new country, knowing nothing of the culture, and to wear that name with pride. In Yiddish, we have a saying, "Und man tracht, und Gott lacht." Man plans, and God laughs. The original plan was for Philip, Moshe, and the brother to then bring over his mother and the rest of the siblings. Being an immigrant to a new country is never easy, but being an immigrant to a new country in which one barely speaks the language or understands your culture is even harder. Moshe and my great uncle decided that America was not the place for them and returned to the Ukraine to continue living with the rest of the family there. By that time, my great-grandfather had married and had already had one little boy, my great-uncle, Ernie. It would be a fateful decision for them and the rest of the family in 1941. His parents, siblings, cousins, aunts, uncles, all those people that he had grown up with, were murdered in 2 days in the worst massacre of World War II, Babi Yar. God certainly wept that day, but not out of humor or mirth. He wept for the destruction of so many innocents, needless death for the sole purpose of continuing hatred and intolerance. While I did not know this until after the war, the reports of the treatment of Jews had made its way into the newspapers of America, and coincidentally New Zealand as well. And he was spurned to join the US Army. You see, the whole time my mother was growing up, she was told her grandfather was just a cab driver. During the war, he just drove the people around. The reality of what he did during the war would not come to light until my own parents went to get married. See, my father was a US Marine during the Vietnam War. And when my parents went to get married, they needed special permission from the Marine Corps due to the fact that my father had a high security clearance level. When they investigated my mother and her family, that's when we learned the truth of what my great-grandfather actually did during the war. An incredibly intelligent man, he spoke English, Russian, Yiddish, and German. These language skills would become invaluable, as he was much more than a simple cab driver. My father tells me when he was called into the office of the Commandant of the Marine Corps, he was informed that my great-grandfather had never been fully decommissioned. He was considered to still be an active spy as part of the CIA. His resistance and ultimate revenge against the Nazis was to use his language skills to gather information and give it to the US Army. I never got a chance to meet him as he passed away before I was born, but we share a love of languages, commitment to eradicating anti-Semitism, and to honoring our family. My dad's mother, Hazel Bradford, was one of millions of women who joined the war effort against the Nazis. A young woman, she worked with the United States Air Force in air traffic control. I remember growing up and going to the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, and my father pointing to the planes in the ceiling and saying, "See that one? Your grandmother helped design that. Her name's on it." He'd take me up there, past where general visitors are supposed to go, just to see her name. The amount of trouble that we got in, it's unbelievable. I'm banned from the Smithsonian. But that's for another story. You see, my grandmother is from proud people who are the epitome of resistance. In my Mihi, you may have heard a word that did not match any of the other Tereo. I come from two Iwi, or two tribes. Hurai, the Tereo word for Jew, and Dine. In English, the word Dine means the people, and it is what the members of the Navajo Nation call themselves. My grandmother is from a tribe without whom the American effort in World War II would have looked vastly different. The Nazis created the Enigma machine to encode their messages and hide their missives from the Allies. Once cracked, though, they were never able to create a new code. The Allies had something better than a machine to pass coded messages. They had the code talkers. These men from many different First Nations peoples used their native languages to transmit messages in the European and Pacific theaters. My grandmother's siblings, cousins, and extended family fought in the war, using their bilingualism as a means to resist the Nazis and the Axis. So, how does two people, both fighting with the American military, equate to resistance? If we take a step back and look at resistance to the Nazis as a whole, we see that it wasn't just a single act of resistance or a single group, but the combined efforts of millions that eventually led to the downfall of Nazi Germany. Resistance inside ghettos and camps, cities and villages, from major armies to ragtag bands of farmers turned fighters. They all resisted the Nazis in their own way. Each act of resistance was a spark that lit the next act until a raging firestorm ignited in a conflagration that brought an end to the Holocaust and the reign of terror that the Nazis had brought to the world.